with a better eye towards design of processes, buildings, the tools that we're asking consumers to use, I think we would all reap the benefits.
Welcome to the operating system. This is Andy Milkowski. This show is for people running complex operations who don't necessarily have time for theory, but want to know what people at the highest levels are doing. So whether you're running an imaging center, leading a radiology department, or even optimizing a complex operation, this show seeks to uncover what separates good from the truly exceptional operations. My guest today is Chris Baxley. Chris started his career in the U.S. Army, left the military, and chose healthcare. That choice took him through Vanderbilt for an MBA, into healthcare and finance, and into investment banking at J.P. Morgan during the 2008 financial crisis. He later went into operating roles at Healthways, Healthgrades, and Rad Partners. At Rad Partners, he led the health system and IDN strategy from 2017 till just last spring, where the practice scaled from just a few hundred radiologists to over 4,000 and partnered with 17 of the 20 largest hospital systems in the country. He's now president and chief growth officer at VitalEngine, a referral and collaboration platform that's going to solve the patient referral problem we'll talk about. He's also one of the most interesting people you've not heard on a podcast before. So, Chris, welcome to the operating system.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's start in the beginning. How did you end up in healthcare?
Yeah, great question. So I was at the end of my Army career. I'd done what's called putting in my packet for separation. So I knew I had a separation date and kind of had to decide what my next step was. I was surveying kind of the business periodicals and beginning to read the Wall Street Journal and refamiliarizing myself with life outside of the military. And very quickly, it stood out to me that healthcare was a place where the problems were big and plentiful. One of the appeals was I'm just by nature someone who enjoys problem solving. The other thing that kind of sealed the deal was I enjoyed the fact that in the military, there was a sort of a sense of nobility. We weren't serving our own individual purposes and interests. We were serving the broader good. And I liked the fact that even as a business person, and I was never under any threat of being a clinician. I don't even think I can spell organic chem, much less have passed the class. So I saw in attaching myself as a business professional to healthcare and specifically to solving some of the plentiful problems that exist in healthcare, that I could attach myself to something, again, that had some nobility to it. So if I'm helping clinicians provide better care to patients by being a business professional background, I can at least have a sense that I'm a cog in a meaningful wheel that's moving things forward and in a better direction. And so that's what ultimately got me towards selecting healthcare as a business professional.
And then I believe you went to Vanderbilt, and so something guided you to go there.
Yeah, sort of similar logic. I was surveying. I realized in leaving the military after not quite 8 years that my skills in finance, which I had majored in undergrad, had dulled. Had been very steeped in a lot of the lessons that the military provides you in terms of leadership and problem solving and organizational skills. But I recognized that some of the hard skills had gotten rusty, and saw business school and getting an MBA as a way to resharpen those and to candidly reposition myself for better opportunities than I would have naturally had coming out of the military. By a bit of stroke of luck, Vanderbilt was high on my list, and at the same exact time was launching a healthcare MBA program. So for the first time in its history, it offered healthcare as a specialization. So I paired that with finance as a specialization concentration and followed that all the way through my time there.
And before we kind of plunge into the post Vanderbilt business era in your life, participated a lot in Project Pyramid. And I think this shows a side of you that many will miss. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting, one of those sometimes unintended consequences can be very good and beneficial. So a peer student had read the book, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. And at that time we had like an email newsletter that went out every day. And he said, "Hey, I want to have this discussion about this book in the auditorium." And so a relative handful of us showed up, and he was describing the thesis for fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. And effectively what it is you have these population-wide issues of poverty in places like India and areas of Africa and South America. And one could make the argument pockets of America, like the Appalachians, have similar issues. And instead of leveraging charity as the primary tool to kind of those populations out of poverty, it used business principles, engaging these people as micro entrepreneurs. It was right in concert with when micro lending and microfinance, which was started by Muhammad Yunus, was really kind of coming into its own. And I identified very much with that very quickly as he was describing that. And so in the room that day were MBA first years. It was a second year who had presented the book. We're like, hey, we should do something about this. And just with sort of the naivete of youth and exuberance, we're like, we're going to start this program. And we kept each other excited about it. We rallied a faculty member to serve as the lead, which we needed to be an official program. In our second year, it was launched. We went to India and to the UAE as part of a trip. And then it's sort of snowballed itself. This is sort of the unintended consequence piece. It has grown and grown at Vanderbilt. It has become its own massive program that people apply to get into. And it's probably one of the things I'm proudest of, but I'd be disingenuous if I said that, oh, we knew it all along. We were just trying to do some good in the small time we were there, and it outlasted us at Vanderbilt.
And you're saying this is still going on today and doing things in the Appalachians as well as around the world?
Yeah, yes, it's still going on to this day. It's much larger than it was when we started it. A gentleman, Cal Turner Jr., who was one of the founders of the Dollar General business, donated some funding to it very early. We sought him out. It's now the Turner Family Center. And it's not just a business school program. It goes across all graduate schools. It involves undergraduates as well. And yes, every year students go to multiple countries to engage in small, businesses and micro lenders and everything to help provide them advice and counsel, in some cases connect them to capital. But it is self-perpetuated and grown significantly.
I think that's an excellent story that you tell about it, especially considering the winds that are blowing through some big cities and such, the whole avoiding charity style fixes.
Yeah, it's still engaged in charity, but you've got to be honest with ourselves and how effective it can and can't be at certain types of problem solving.
Yeah. Let's pivot over to the business side now.
Yeah.
After Vanderbilt, you found yourself at JP Morgan in Wall Street around the financial crisis. So I imagine there's some stories you can tell.
Yeah, there's plenty of stories to be told. So I had the benefit of graduating business school in 2007. And I'd interned at JP Morgan in their healthcare group, and had gotten an offer to go back on a full-time basis. And so, funny story, the JP Morgan brought their entire global investment banking training class, so 100 plus newly minted associates to New York for training. And it's summer of 2007. We're down in the financial district at a building doing training. And we're having a guest lecturer come in from the capital markets team. And he kind of came in the door and kind of beside the time he's banging away on his BlackBerry. And he said, hey guys, apologies. I need a minute. I'll be back. We're dealing with a credit crunch in the markets. I just got to get some notes out. And I leaned over to my buddy, Dustin Salveson. I was like, Dustin, what's a credit crunch? Like what we had in my 2 years in school, that term had not come up. And so that was the initial pebble in still waters that created these massive tsunamis that were the financial crisis. So I was on the street during all of that. It made for interesting times. As the Chinese curse goes, may you live in interesting times. I definitely did for that period. But yeah, lots of lessons learned, but unfortunately it wasn't as fruitful financially as it normally would have been for somebody putting in 80 and 100-hour weeks coming out of business.
Let's see if we could bring that to some of the folks listening to it and perhaps to a radiology operations and some of the things you had to do in order to help.
Yeah. So it's interesting if you go back in that time in history, and I guess if you were an economics nerd, you might find it worth going back and reviewing, but there was a very interesting dynamic as the financial crisis unfolded in that it created these incredible, call it buying opportunities if you're an acquisitive company. However, the fear in the market in terms of the volatility, in which direction the market was going to go, caused even those who sat on liquid capital to just sit tight. And so no deals were really getting done. What was happening it is that, you had in a number of instances, you had healthcare companies who were about to default on debt covenants and needed to recapitalize their balance sheet. In some cases, at the 11th hour, like, within weeks of these defaults. And so we did a fair bit of those recapping of balance sheets because of issues with debt covenants and other capitalization issues. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of M&A and activity, which is the more fun stuff if you're a junior banker to sink your teeth into. So it was fairly mundane, but at the same time, mildly terrifying.
Are there lessons that are applicable from that time to practitioners of operations today?
Yeah, I think there are lessons. I don't know if they would be specific to come out of the financial crisis. You could kind of come to more recent times and like the No Surprises Act and some of the pressures that created are analogous in terms of, you really need to have a financially astute team with their hand on the wheel in times of crisis or in times of uncertainty. And if you're thinking that you can, as executive leaders of a practice or hospital or what have you, you can just quote unquote check in every quarter, that's not sufficient. Things move too quickly. Crises evolve very, very quickly. They don't take years. They take, in some cases, weeks or months to develop. And so a more frequent check-in, I would say, ensuring that you're pressure testing thing with assumptions that might seem outlandish. So if your cost of capital is X, some people might say, well, if it goes up to X plus 1, we'll be okay. Well, what if it goes up to X plus 2 or X times 2? What happens then? And so it drove home for me the importance of the financial crisis that is, and then subsequently the NSA reinforced that, the importance of being proactive with managing your financials, to anticipate crises and have a game plan for if and when they do develop.
And I imagine there's probably some instruction you would give besides checking in more often on each site, something about maybe making sure that you're making money on each encounter.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely. In healthcare is not terribly unique in this, but we're maybe a little bit more exposed to the dynamics of it. You, in many cases, deliberately have loss leaders where you're losing money on a certain type of encounter, a certain type of patient interaction. But the belief is that you'll offset that with the more profitable encounters with these other types. If you don't keep an active eye on that, in some things that are profitable in one setting, suddenly the system changes and they become unprofitable. If you're not maintaining awareness that in the moment, you can't respond to it. You can't make the appropriate decision alterations that are needed to keep yourself healthy financially. And the old saying is you can't make it up if you're losing money on every unit. It's certainly true in healthcare, and we're probably more sensitive to it than other areas of the economy are. So maintaining an active awareness of your loss leaders versus your profitable procedures, making sure over time that those stay consistent, and if they move around, then adjust accordingly.
Yeah, I just your conversation makes me think of some of the cyber attack and payments no longer going out and practices folding just simply because the cash flow gets interrupted for a short period of time.
Yeah. One of the unfortunate dynamics in healthcare, particularly on the independent practice side, is a lot of them function in a cash collections not just on a cash accounting basis, but very much in kind of a hand to mouth financial way where the partners, they bring in the money, they distribute to partners, and you hear these horror stories. And unfortunately, there were a multitude of them around the NSA's passage where, senior physicians in these practices thought that they were doing well. And it was only, 9 months, 12 months later where they realized, oh no, we're underwater and we're insolvent and we're going to have to fold up shop. That's terrible. You don't want to see folks go through that.
Going from that bleak look on life, before I had spoken with you, I had not realized how much one of your next roles had in the healthcare system was Healthgrades.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a little bit about that model and how it worked? Because it was an absolutely fascinating story.
Yeah. So Healthgrades, I guess I'll focus primarily on the website. There's also a marketing arm of Healthgrades as it existed when I was there. But there are comparables to the marketing. It was using psychographics to get the right postcard in the right mailbox. But the website where there was the greatest financial impact was built on the understanding that patients, and we found out later, physicians as well, go online to find physicians and facilities to appoint with. So a patient moves, the stereotypical case, a family moves into a town, they need to find an OB, they need to find a primary care provider for their family. And so they go online and they start searching. What we did was we created effectively a two-sided marketplace with consumers who were searching for physicians on one end. And then on the other side of the marketplace, the provider organizations of various types who wanted to be found. And the magnitude of impact is kind of hard to describe and hard to believe. But when we launched the program where, let's just say, Acme Hospital becomes a client, they want to feature X number of their physicians. When the program was launched and their physicians were featured, the call volume went up like the day of launch. Like it was a material impact that could be felt and seen immediately. And so we generated at Healthgrades significant increase in appointing volumes. And you can guess, with familiarity to healthcare, appointments lead to, E&M consults, lead to potential procedures. And so the financial benefit, if you will, to our partners was significant. In fact, in some cases, absurdly so. We may get to that. So yes, in Healthgrades while I was there, I led all of our large IDN relationships, so large multi-state hospital operators. That strategy and that growth fell on my shoulders.
I didn't appreciate until you had started explaining the fact that this was really a B2B business, right? That most of the money was actually coming from those that were advertising, in effect, physicians.
Yes. I think that the B2C game in healthcare is fraught with risk. I think there's a future for it. Some would argue against that. But candidly, it was an easier transaction. It was an easier model to make it B2B, but with a B2C surface on. In other words, the website was marketed to and of greatest value to consumers, but the consumer was not paying to use the website.
Right.
It's very directly analogous to, like, if you pay attention to like Google AdWords, you're being advertised to. It's plainly denoted on the site. It's the same thing. It's the same dynamic of just, if you can get your name above the fold on the page digitally, you're going to get more traffic.
I didn't appreciate quite the scale that you talked about. And you used some examples with me that the numbers are kind of mind-boggling. You already mentioned one where that it had impact on the day of launch, but there's others.
Yeah. I guess two stories that kind of typify the magnitude of effect that I'll share. One is, our account management, we call them directors of client development at the time. Those teams would go out and they would provide quarterly report outs to our clients. And I would, in some cases where those clients were part of a large IDN that I was responsible for the relationship with, I would review them. And so the analysts would go and they would crunch the numbers and they would put together a slide or a table, and that would get put into a deck that would be presented. Well, the numbers were absurdly high. They were, in many cases, ROIs in the teens. So a 12, 13, 15x ROI, which in most areas of the economy is really crazy, but particularly so in healthcare where, hospital companies, which were our clients, they can buy on low, mid single digit margins, not, so like a 0.04x return. And here we are coming in the door with a 12, 15x ROI. So realizing how that would be perceived and received, I said, hey, I know that the numbers are really 13x. We'd audit the numbers to make sure we weren't like sort of drinking our own Kool-Aid, that they were in fact real. And I said, hey, look, you can't present a 13x in front of a hospital CFO. Cut that down to a 4 to a 6. And the analysts are like, but the numbers are really higher. I was like, I get it. And I believe it. And I know it's true. But the CFOs on the other side are not going to believe that. So that's one example. We did that routinely. And the funny thing is, these executives, they're not stupid. They're able to audit the results themselves. And so we had a few that would let loose to us. Hey guys, I know you're telling us it's a 6x. We're seeing something different. They would kind of have a smile, but they wouldn't tell us. I'm like, I know, but it's enough to get the business done and keep the business. The other example that I don't know if we discussed when we met before is in one instance, very large IDN customer, multi-state hospital operator spread across multiple states, had its own call center, very large call center, in fact. And all of the calls from Healthgrades that were seeking to appoint with one of their physicians went to their call center. So one day I get somewhat of a panic call. I get this voicemail of, "Hey, Chris, I need you to call me back right now." I call, it's the corporate head that oversees all of the call centers. She's like, "Our call centers are quiet." I'm like, what's going on? She goes, "None of the Healthgrades calls are coming through." And what I realized then, as she shared, is Healthgrades at that time was representing 65% of the calls going into the call center. So we had some sort of a glitch on the website that caused the number to be displayed to be incorrect. And we quickly corrected it within the day, but her call center agents were just sitting there like waiting on calls. So, concrete example that, these things are happening in real time, that the effect is real. And we have a version of that quote unquote problem today with VitalEngine, with the returns that we generate are sometimes so high that they invite questioning, which we're happy to have. So yeah, it was real. It still is, I'm sure.
And in my mind, is this really similar to, if you're like running an imaging center, is this actually very similar to taking out Google AdWords?
I think it could be. Here's the thing that you run into with imaging centers is who's making the appointment. One of the things that I would encourage business professionals in healthcare to always be clear on is who the customer is and who's actually pulling the levers on getting that customer, the patient, from A to B. So if you have a true B2C plan and you're implementing it and you're going to market in front of the consumer, then yeah, I think that an AdWords type approach, getting your name above the fold in search results, and now you have the complexity of LLMs playing a role in how people search. But yes, if you're looking at your own operations, you're like, look, 90% of our appointing is coming from physicians appointing in, then maybe the public, the sort of SEO and the modern equivalents are not as fruitful. But if you're a B2C operator and you're seeing gains, then yeah, you should.
And since you were collecting a lot of data through this, I imagine you've done a lot of analysis on how consumers of healthcare actually choose who they go to.
Yeah, we did a lot of that. And this is likely going to upset some of the listeners. When I was at Healthgrades, we sat atop a lot of data, and I've been in different groups since where we've done something similar. When you look really closely at what causes elasticity in consumer preference going from provider A to provider B, I think a lot of us would like to assume it's the proficiency, it's the clinical excellence, it's the years of training, it's the subspecialized training. It's a lot of the things that physicians think of first when they think of themselves. The reality at the time, and this is a little bit dated, but still I would imagine still very current, is that convenience was the number one factor in how patients chose to appoint. And it wasn't number one by a small margin. It was number one by orders of magnitude to number 2, 3, and 5 down the list. And so and I look at convenience, and I think I would encourage others to do something very similar through a scale of distance and time. How far does a patient have to travel to appoint with you? And how much time does a patient have to wait to appoint with you? And if you can decrease both distances, the distance they have to travel and the amount of time they have to wait, and you can somehow get that in front of a consumer. For example, some provider organizations tout same-day appointment scheduling. Consumers really respond to that because you have to take yourself out of the business professional, clinical professional, and imagine you're just a family in need of care for a member of the family. You want it as soon as you can get it. In some cases, there's a lot of stress around that. There's a lot of uncertainty. Is this diagnosis going to be critical? And so the ability to get care quickly, convenience, rules the day with consumers. I do think there's a door opening with some of what's available in terms of, particularly within the radiology space, to potentially differentiate on quality. But candidly, for most specialties, that's just, there's not sufficient uniformly available information to distinguish the quality of provider A versus provider B. Now, if you're inside of the hospital, you're like, well, I know that Dr. Jones is better than Dr. Smith, but do you know it in a way that you can communicate it effectively and objectively to a consumer or to a physician audience? And usually that answer is no. And so again, convenience rules the day.
I like your analogy of plotting time and distance on a graph. So you want to be in the lower left-hand corner rather than the upper right-hand corner. And we have heard other stories that are similar to that, where a business can be increased just by simply doing nighttime hours or Saturday hours to help people work around their other jobs or something like that.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about the working professional, which, let's be candid, most people want to chase patients who are insured by commercial payers. Well, what are commercial payers members doing during the workday? They're working too. So yeah, absolutely. If you can find off hours that are convenient for those people, then you will likely be able.
So it seems like you're really doing well there. And then after a couple of steps, you end up at Rad Partners. How does that story work?
It's funny. It involves a headhunter who had reached out years prior for a position and I had passed on. He came back. He was a very likable guy. He came back around. He's like, hey, Chris, I've got this thing, Rad Partners. And I'd never envisioned myself being that close to clinical delivery, to be honest. I always thought I would be in sort of the peripheral businesses like a Healthgrades or, those that are enabling provider organizations. I didn't necessarily think operating inside of a provider organization was on my path. But he said, hey, you really need to listen to these guys. They're mission driven. They've got a vision for where they want to steer radiology, both of which were very positive. And the executive team, really have my words, not his, have their heads screwed on straight. Like they're smart, they're good decision makers, and they're serious about doing this. And so I approached the first conversation with Rad Partners a little bit with my arms crossed, like, all right, I'll hear you guys out. But as executive after executive kind of spoke to what the vision was, what the mission was, how they had a plan to execute on that seemed very viable to me. It didn't take me too many of those conversations to go, all right, these are people I could throw my hat in the ring with and would love to put some work effort towards. So I joined and kind of did something very similar to what I described at Healthgrades, where I led our large idea and strategy and growth.
And I believe in some of your writings or in our conversation, you talked about what were some of the keys to success for Rad Partners. Some of that may have included tech stacks and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think early on it's a little bit hard to define, but I'll do my best at it. One is there are certain principles that I credit Rad Partners from its earliest days, well before I came on board, sorting out things like mission and vision and principles and values before they really started to grow in earnest. So one of the things about Rad Partners was the principle of one practice locally led. So Rad Partners, when you speak to people from Rad Partners, they don't call it a business, call it a practice. And I think that's an intentional, forcing of the lexicon around how you think and speak of the practice. But the one practice locally led was bringing intentionality to saying, look, we are going to consolidate various practices, but we would be foolish to quote unquote, acquire a practice on Friday and then on Monday go and tell them how to run their business. Physicians like autonomy. Now, I will say that physicians like autonomy, but then once they have a lot of it and they're running a practice, they're like, man, we don't really enjoy this billing thing. We don't really enjoy this legal thing. We don't really enjoy, rev cycle management. And so what was central to the RP model and still is to this day is these practices are able to join. They largely have autonomy to direct how they schedule, how they contract, how they pay. But then RP took all of the stuff that folks don't go to medical school to do, legal, RCM, all that stuff off of their plates. And so everything really had to be passed through the lens of, are the physicians accepting of this? Which to volunteer yourself for that at the outset as a primarily group of business professionals, there were physicians in the leadership mix as well. But that just says a lot about the culture and the character that again was set in place day zero before it grew to 4,000 plus radiology.
And there's probably some benefits from partnering with Rad Partners or becoming part of the practice. It relates to just being able to be much more of a full service and be able to provide subspecialties.
Yeah, absolutely. The subspecialized question is one that you really need scale to be able to successfully address, with very few exceptions. So if you think about, I think, the average practice size, call it somewhere between 12 and 15 radiologists. If you are trying to provide subspecialized coverage to your client hospital or other sites of care, and they say, hey, we really need somebody that's a peds rad. If one of your 12 radiologists is a peds rad, and the partner site you're working with doesn't bring you sufficient volumes to occupy that peds rad with predominantly or exclusively pediatric cases, then you've created a suboptimal staffing model. And so then it makes it harder to recruit that peds rep, because what do people who go through the extra effort to subspecialize want to do? They want to practice within that subspecialty. And so what RP was able to quickly do, and it was somewhat via technology, but nothing that was terribly complicated, was to realize that by scaling, you could give greater assurance to your partner service sites, hospitals, and so forth, that you could provide that subspecialized care. But if it's a contract in Atlanta, your peds rad might be, you might have one in Atlanta, you might have one in Chicago, you might have one in San Antonio. And so the queuing theory of subspecialized coverage when you're subscale gets really difficult to work out. When you scale, it gets much, much easier to sort out. And so that was one of the benefits / advantages that RP was quick to create and capitalize.
Any other items at Rad Partners that you think explain for just the incredible success they've been on for a number of years?
There's the aforementioned, ensuring that physicians are in the loop and part of the decision-making process. I don't think that when you're in healthcare and clinical delivery, you should ever alienate physicians. Now, I don't mean that to say that physicians always make the exact right decision, but they need a seat at the table, and they need their voices to be heard, because ultimately we are talking about clinical care. So that's one. Two are realizing, sort of along the lines that we just described with subspecialized coverage, that there were certain benefits of scale. And so scale, yes, you want to pursue it for the obvious reasons like financial benefit and all that. But the reality is, you can't achieve an objective, a mission as aggressive and such a BHAG as transform radiology the way that RP has set out for itself, without creating pressures on the market, without creating a positive example of how things could be that forces others that never will join RP to adjust their behaviors to accommodate. The technology certainly played a role in that. You could not have done the subspecialized cross coverage I described without, a suitable tech stack. And in some cases that put us at odds with partners who were like, no, you have to use our tech stack. Well, if we use your tech stack, we can only leverage the radiologists that are in your physical building. Do you really want to hold us to that? And in a few cases they said yes, and we just couldn't figure out a way to make that work. And in a few cases they said, no, we'll adjust. So those are the big ones that come to mind, but I'm sure that's not an exhaustive list.
No, absolutely. Wow. And after RP, you've moved on to VitalEngine.
Yeah.
And again, some of those listening to this probably don't know what the problem VitalEngine seeks to solve.
Yeah. So we're still in the early days. I'm hopeful that the story is analogous to RP, where, in 2018, when I joined, there not many folks knew who we were, and then suddenly everybody did. So VitalEngine, before I tell you what we do, I'll go frame the problem. In the US, across specialties, when a referral is made for a patient to receive some form of follow-up, either specialized, subspecialized care, what have you, the literature suggests that it's between 35 and as much as 50% of the time that referral is not consummated. That patient doesn't receive that care. And so if you take the higher value, it's kind of a coin toss. When you're a physician and you've diagnosed that your patient needs some sort of follow-up care, it's a coin toss, literally, as to whether or not they get that. Now, when you break down the components of what's to blame for that, a lot of it comes down to really two things that are very much interrelated: simple communications A lot of physicians who make referrals can tell you horror stories of a patient needing a referral. They pick up the phone, they call, voicemail. They pick up the phone, they call, rings indefinitely. They pick up the phone, they call, finally get an answer. Can you see my patient? Yes. We can get them in. So that third physician office that they called may have the impression that the referral landed in their lap based on intentionality, that they were sought out. The reality goes back to what we talked about with convenience. They were just able to see them. The other is getting various types of information to include imaging. So DICOM imaging formats from A to B. We are still in the practice today, believe it or not. And well, most people believe this because we still use fax machines, but we're still in the practice today in many places of burning a CD-ROM with DICOM imagery, handing it to a patient and saying, please take this with you when you get follow-up care. And I don't need to tell this audience or you that CD-ROM does not always make it to its destination. And so what we've done, and we're founded by a cardiologist out of UAB, Dr. Philip Johnson. Years ago, he was very frustrated with seeing CD-ROMs with imaging come in, CD-ROMs not show up that were supposed to be there. And he created VitalEngine to create a communication platform that ties into PACS and EMR on both the sending and receiving side. And is itself its own communication medium where physicians can connect and they can effectively text back and forth to each other. They can move case conferences out of the boardroom online from a synchronous fashion where everybody has to dedicate the same 2 hours on Thursday afternoon to an asynchronous fashion where you can chime in with your input in times that suit you. And so again, we work with primarily health systems right now. And we suffer from the same problem I described before with Healthgrades, where when we're integrated and implemented, the returns very quickly get sort of absurdly high. So we're having to explain how, in our case, an 8 to 12x ROI is actually happening. But again, our clients are not fools. They see the data for themselves and they're quick to go, wait a minute, these guys are really generating huge returns because, again, most health systems think about themselves as being in competition with pure health systems. For the 50% of referrals that are getting completed, they're just now understanding that there's competition for the 50% of the referrals that's going to nowhere. These are referrals that end up going nowhere. And so just capturing a modicum of those referrals creates tremendous lift for our partner systems. And we're proud to be a part of it.
In your experience there, would you be able to say that, let's say, an imaging center that hooks up with VitalEngine and makes connections to obviously refers, that would be a method to increase volume?
Yes. And the pause was because of the thinking through the referral ecosystem. But yes, I think in most instances, if you can, as an independent outpatient imaging center or partnered outpatient imaging center, if you can say that we have a mechanism to get imaging to you, no matter what system you're on, I think that creates added value and added attraction to you. So that's not currently what we hang our hat on. It's really on helping health systems grow volumes, but there's no reason to believe that wouldn't play out for imaging centers as well.
Wow. I'm surprised that in a short period of time, you have one after another of ways for sites that need to grow volume, that there's mechanisms to do that. It almost seems like a consumer and just a connectivity level.
Nothing I've described from Healthgrades to RP to VitalEngine, none of the solutions are technological whiz bang. It took a genius to create, not to disparage those that created it. It's really looking at the problem and saying, this shouldn't exist, that you shouldn't have a problem with patients finding the appropriate physician. You shouldn't have a problem getting your patient to a referred subspecialist. How do we solve that? In the true Occam's razor fashion, we just constructed something that's very simple. It's not terribly difficult to understand. I get asked the question all the time. So are you guys AI enabled? And the truth is we'll leverage AI when it's a value add to the platform and to our partners. And right now it's minimal AI. It's just blocking and tackling around communication and data transfer, where candidly that hasn't existed. So yeah.
So let's wrap this up. This is excellent. Let's wrap it up with a few rapid fire questions.
Yeah.
Seeing you had that excellent experience back at Vanderbilt, what's one book every operator running a healthcare business should read?
I'm going to give you a non-traditional answer. I'm sure everybody has read sort of the must-have business books. I'm a big fan of things like, Start With Why and others. I think that every healthcare business operator should read Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things. Don Norman is the godfather, if you will, of human-centered design, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's designing around the human instead of asking the human to sort of wrap themselves around the design. And I had just pulled it down the other day to reread it, and I flipped it open. And one of the first notes that I'd handwritten in one of the first pages is that good design is invisible. And if you look at the encounters from the consumer's perspective, if you look at encounters with the healthcare ecosystem, none of it feels invisible. It all feels obstructionist in nature. It all feels like this thing to overcome. And I think with a better eye towards design of processes, buildings, the tools that we're asking consumers to use, I think we would all reap the benefits. So again, Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things, I think is one that people would benefit.
Awesome. I was going to ask a question of operational excellence in one sentence, but you may have already answered that one.
Do the blocking and tackling first, and then try to get sexy with the rest of it.
Yeah. Healthcare, especially your RP experience, healthcare in a few years from now, more consolidated or less? I know there's some recent changes with reimbursement, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think more. And it's not that I'm rooting for more. It's that I just think it's becoming more and more difficult to exist as an island, as a small practice without the benefits of scale that we described. So it's either more consolidation or figuring out how to create the benefits of consolidation without actually doing it.
Awesome. Thank you. So, Chris, for folks that want to learn more about VitalEngine or connect with you directly, where should they go?
Well, for VitalEngine, it's vitalengine.com. For me directly, the best thing and the only thing I really engage much with lately is LinkedIn. I'm the Chris Baxley at VitalEngine in Nashville, and love to connect with folks.
Awesome. Chris, this is the conversation I hoped it would be. The convenience beats reputation or argument alone is worth the listen. And I like the through line of kind of that noble cog. It's exactly the right thesis for this show. Thank you for being here. Thanks everyone for listening. And if you get something out of this conversation, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and connect with me on LinkedIn at Andy Milkowski. I will be the only one. This is the operating system, and see you next time.